Welcome to our deep dive into the world of corporations through the lens of Peter Drucker's concept of the corporation.
Yeah.
You shared some excerpts with us, and the book focuses on General Motors.
Right.
It was written back in 1946.
Yes.
And then updated in 83.
Uh-huh.
So we'll get to see how Drucker's ideas have held up over time.
It really is fascinating.
Okay, so we're diving into this book, focusing on General Motors, but what should we know about the context in which it was written?
Well, Drucker sets the stage with this idea of capitalism in one country, which was a prevailing belief in post-war America.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people felt that the free enterprise system could only really thrive if the U.S. remained the dominant economic superpower.
Interesting.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
After World War II, the U.S. was in a unique position.
Right.
Much of Europe was rebuilding, and America's industrial capacity was largely untouched.
Uh-huh.
So there was this sense that for capitalism to truly succeed, it needed a strong, singular nation to kind of lead the way.
So was Drucker arguing for this capitalism in one country idea, or was he just describing the mindset of the time?
He was primarily describing the context,
Yeah.
using it as a lens to analyze General Motors, which he saw as the quintessential large corporation operating within this system.
Okay.
He even says that back then, the average person might have been more familiar with how a corporation worked than with the inner workings of the government.
Yeah.
That's how central corporations were to American life.
The corporation as a microcosm of American society. Okay, so let's talk about General Motors specifically.
Sure.
What were some of Drucker's key observations about the company?
One of the things that really struck me was how Drucker emphasized the human element of corporations.
Okay.
He saw them as primarily human endeavors, not just collections of machines and factories. And he illustrates this beautifully with an anecdote about General Motors' wartime conversion from car production to airplane manufacturing. Imagine having to shift gears practically overnight, organizing thousands of workers, retooling factories, figuring out new processes, and managing the flow of completely different materials.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's huge. That's a fantastic example.
Yeah.
It really highlights the complexity of coordinating human effort on such a massive scale.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did Drucker delve into how GM actually pulled this shift off?
Yeah.
Was there a secret to their success?
He does. He points to decentralization as a core principle of GM's management philosophy.
Yeah.
Their organizational structure, with its various divisions, was designed to resemble federalism in a way. You had central management setting the overall direction and broad policies, but then they gave a surprising amount of autonomy to each division to manage their own operations.
Decentralization, that sounds great in theory, but how do they make it work in practice?
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't that lead to chaos with everyone doing their own thing?
That's a great question, and
Yeah.
Drucker addresses that directly. He describes some fascinating practices that GM used to keep things aligned and efficient.
Okay.
For instance, they had these Sloan meetings, where executives from different levels and divisions would come together regularly to discuss policies, problems, and share best practices.
Okay.
This fostered communication and alignment, even with so much autonomy at the divisional level.
So it wasn't just decentralization for the sake of decentralization.
Right.
They had systems in place to make it work.
Yeah.
What else?
Another interesting practice was the use of base pricing as an objective yardstick to measure the efficiency of each division and assess the effectiveness of overall policies. This allowed them to track performance, identify areas for improvement, and ensure everyone was pulling in the same direction.
So they had these mechanisms for coordination and accountability.
Right.
But wasn't Drucker also interested in the social impact of corporations?
Yes, absolutely.
How does that fit into his analysis of GM?
He saw General Motors as not just a business, but also a reflection of American society and its values.
Okay.
Remember, he was writing in the context of post-war America, a time when people believed in the idea that social institutions should serve a purpose beyond just profit.
Yeah.
They should contribute to the well-being of individuals and society as a whole.
And how did GM embody this belief?
Drucker points to things like their efforts to provide equal opportunities for advancement and individual fulfillment for their employees.
Okay.
They weren't just trying to maximize profits. They genuinely believed in creating a workplace that fostered personal growth and contributed to the greater good.
So he's saying that corporations, even massive ones like GM, should be judged not just on their financial performance,
Right.
but also on their contribution to society.
Yes,
And he analyzes them on 3 levels, right?
exactly. He looks at them as autonomous entities, their internal workings, their efficiency, their profitability.
Okay.
Then, as parts of society, how they impact their communities, their employees, their suppliers. Uh-huh.
And finally, in relation to basic social beliefs, how they align with the values and aspirations of the society they operate in.
Hmm.
Drucker's point is that all 3 levels need to function well for an institution to truly thrive and make a positive impact.
That's a powerful way to think about it. It's not just about the bottom line. It's about the bigger picture. Okay, so we've talked about capitalism in one country, the human element of corporations, decentralization, and the social impact of business. What else did Drucker delve into?
Well, he dedicated a significant portion of the book to exploring the challenges
Okay.
faced by large corporations in fulfilling their social role, particularly when it comes to their workforce.
Okay.
He was very interested in what he called the worker problem.
The worker problem. Can you unpack that a bit? What
Okay.
exactly did he mean by that?
He was referring to the challenges of integrating the worker into industrial society, finding ways to make work meaningful and fulfilling,
Okay.
addressing issues of worker dissatisfaction.
And creating a sense of belonging and purpose for people who are often treated as just cogs in a machine.
Yeah.
He uses General Motors' own experience with its workforce as a primary case study.
So what were some of the specific issues he highlighted?
One of the key issues he discussed was the problem of monotony in assembly line work.
Okay.
But his take on it was nuanced. He argued that it wasn't necessarily the repetitive nature of the tasks itself
Okay.
that led to worker dissatisfaction, but rather the lack of meaning and social status associated with those tasks.
So it's not just about the work itself, but about how that work is perceived and valued within the larger context of the organization and society.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
He contrasts this with the experience of women who worked on assembly lines during the war.
Okay.
Interestingly, they seem to be less affected by this monotony. And Drucker suggests it's because they derived a sense of social meaning and contribution from their work. They knew they were playing a vital role in the war effort, which gave their work a significance that transcended the repetitive nature of the tasks themselves.
That's a really interesting observation.
Yeah.
It seems to suggest that people are more likely to find fulfillment in their work if they feel like they're making a real difference,
Right.
even if the tasks themselves are repetitive. Did he have any other insights into this worker problem?
He dedicated a whole section to the role of the foreman, which he saw as a crucial link between management and workers.
Okay.
He described the unique position of the foreman in the American industrial system as a member of the industrial middle class. Unlike their counterparts in Europe, American foremen had a significant level of authority and influence, acting as both technical experts and personnel managers.
So they weren't just taskmasters, they were also responsible for the well-being and development of their teams.
Right. But Drucker noted that even back then, the foreman's role was already evolving, becoming more technical
Okay.
and less focused on personnel management. He suggested that this shift might have contributed to a decline in the foreman's social status and function, raising some important questions about how corporations could create a more fulfilling and impactful role for their frontline supervisors.
So even back then, he was already seeing this disconnect between management and the workers. Did he offer any solutions for this disconnect?
He analyzed two common approaches, paternalism and unionism,
Okay.
but argued that neither fully addressed the worker problem. Paternalism, he felt, failed to acknowledge the worker's desire for dignity and responsibility as an adult.
Okay.
It created a sense of dependence rather than empowerment.
So paternalism wasn't the answer. What about unionism?
He acknowledged the importance of unions in protecting worker rights, but argued that unionism often took a negative anti-management stance,
Okay.
which hindered true industrial citizenship and collaboration. He felt that for corporations to truly succeed as social institutions, they needed to find new and innovative ways to create a sense of belonging, purpose, and opportunity for all their employees.
So it sounds like he was advocating for a more collaborative approach.
Yes.
Where management and workers are partners in creating a more fulfilling and productive work environment.
That's a good way to put it. He saw this as a major challenge for corporations moving forward, and one that would require new thinking and a willingness to move beyond traditional solutions.
And those ideas of worker empowerment and collaboration still resonate today, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, they're probably even more relevant now than they were in Drucker's time.
Well, We're going to have to dive deeper into those ideas, but we're out of time for today.
Right.
We'll continue this conversation next time.
Looking forward to it.
See you next time.
See you then.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Peter Drucker's concept of the corporation. Last time we left off talking about the worker problem and how General Motors tried to address it. But Drucker's analysis goes beyond just one company. He also explores the broader economic and social landscape in which corporations operate.
Yeah, he dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls the curse of bigness. It's fascinating how he tackles this issue, especially considering the time period.
Hold on, curse of bigness.
Wow.
What exactly does he mean by that? It sounds a little ominous.
Well, you have to remember that he was writing in the wake of World War II.
Right.
The fear of monopolies and unchecked corporate power was very real.
Mm.
Drucker uses this term to describe the challenges and societal anxieties
Okay.
that arise when corporations become so large and influential that they potentially stifle competition and wield significant economic and political power.
So it's not just about size, it's about the potential negative consequences
Right.
of unchecked corporate power.
Exactly.
Did he see this as an inevitable outcome of capitalism?
He doesn't necessarily frame it as inevitable, that he does acknowledge that it's a real concern.
Right.
And he challenges the effectiveness of traditional economic policies in regulating these giant corporations.
Mm-hmm.
He emphasizes the need for long-term perspectives when it comes to corporate policy and uses General Motors' approach to managing its supply staffs as a case study.
Interesting. So how did GM manage its supply chain in a way that addressed this curse of bigness?
Drucker points to their focus on stability and technological advancement,
Okay.
arguing that a company's policy towards its suppliers can have a significant impact on overall economic stability.
Mm-hmm.
If a large corporation like GM squeezes its suppliers too hard, it could destabilize the entire ecosystem.
Right.
On the other hand, by fostering long-term relationships and investing in its suppliers' technological capabilities,
Okay.
GM could contribute to a more stable and innovative economy.
So it's a more collaborative and sustainable approach,
Yeah.
rather than just trying to extract the lowest possible price from suppliers.
Mm,
It seems like Drucker is advocating for a more holistic view of business,
exactly.
where the well-being of the entire ecosystem matters.
And this leads to another fascinating concept he explores.
Yeah.
The idea of profit.
Wait, isn't profit the whole point of a corporation? I mean, that's what we're taught in business school.
Yes, that's the common assumption. But Drucker challenges us to go beyond that simplistic view.
Okay.
He argues that for a corporation to be truly successful in an industrial society, it must focus on use rather than just profit.
Use rather than profit. Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little confused. Can you explain what he means by that?
He's essentially saying that fixating solely on maximizing short-term profits can actually be detrimental in the long run.
Okay.
He believes that corporations should prioritize creating value and meeting real societal needs. In other words, profit should be a consequence of fulfilling a useful purpose, not the sole driving force. It's about finding that sweet spot where corporate success aligns with societal benefit.
So it's not about ignoring profit,
Right.
but about seeing it as a result of creating something valuable
Exactly.
for society.
And this ties back to his earlier points about the social responsibility of corporations. It's about recognizing that businesses have a role to play in creating a better world, not just generating wealth for shareholders.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned that Drucker was writing in the context of post-war America. What were some of the other economic concerns he addressed?
One of the major concerns of that era was full employment.
Right.
The memories of the Great Depression were still fresh.
Yeah,
And people were worried about mass unemployment as soldiers returned from the war.
right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What did Drucker have to say about that?
Yeah.
Did he offer any solutions?
He did. He explored the limitations of traditional approaches like public works programs,
Okay.
arguing that while they might provide temporary relief, they didn't address the underlying structural issues of an industrial economy.
So what did he propose as an alternative?
He emphasized the need for new ventures and a more dynamic approach to economic policy. He seemed to advocate for creating an environment that fostered innovation and entrepreneurship, arguing that lasting full employment could only be achieved through a thriving, adaptable economy that constantly created new opportunities.
So instead of relying on government intervention to create jobs, he was suggesting that the focus should be on fostering a more entrepreneurial ecosystem
Exactly.
where businesses could create jobs organically.
And keep in mind, he was writing this decades before the rise of Silicon Valley and the modern tech industry.
Wow.
He seemed to anticipate that the nature of work would change,
Yeah.
that we'd need to move beyond traditional models of employment.
It's fascinating how prescient some of his observations were. So we've talked about the curse of bigness,
Hmm.
the importance of use over just profit, and the need for a dynamic entrepreneurial economy. Did he address how the changing nature of work might impact the social responsibilities of corporations?
Absolutely. In his updated epilogue from 1983, Drucker reflects on the evolving landscape of work in society. He notes the decline of traditional blue-collar jobs and the rise of what we now call knowledge work. Remember, this is well before the internet and the personal computer revolutionized the workplace.
Wow, so he was already seeing this shift coming way back in the early 80s.
He was. And he argues that this transition to a knowledge-based economy creates new challenges and opportunities for businesses and society.
I can only imagine. What kind of challenges and opportunities?
Well, for one, he emphasized that as work becomes more knowledge-based,
Uh,
the role of the employee shifts from a passive recipient of orders to an active contributor, someone who needs more than just a paycheck. He argued that corporations would need to adapt and find new ways to empower their employees to tap into their knowledge and creativity.
So it's not just about managing people. It's about creating an environment where knowledge workers can thrive and contribute their unique skills and talents.
Exactly. And this ties back to his earlier point about corporations needing to focus on use rather than just profit by empowering their employees and fostering a culture of innovation.
Right.
Corporations can not only enhance their own productivity, but also contribute to the growth and well-being of society as a whole. It's a win-win situation.
It sounds like Drucker was really ahead of his time in recognizing the importance of human capital and the need for a more collaborative, purposeful approach to work. This is all incredibly insightful, but I have to admit I'm a little overwhelmed by all these ideas.
I understand. It's a lot to take in. But don't worry, we'll unpack all of this and discuss its relevance to the modern world in our next segment.
That's a great idea. I'm really looking forward to hearing your take on what all this means for us today. Welcome back to our deep dive into Peter Drucker's concept of the corporation. It's amazing how relevant his ideas from the 1940s and 80s still are to the business world today. We've been unpacking his analysis of General Motors, but I'm curious to hear your perspective on what all this means for businesses in the 21st century.
You know, it's striking how Drucker's insights into organizational structure, leadership, and the need for businesses to address the worker problem remain incredibly relevant.
Yeah.
The challenges of managing large organizations, finding meaning in work, and navigating the relationship between corporations and society haven't gone away. If anything, they've become even more complex.
Absolutely. I'm particularly struck by how Drucker foresaw the shift to a knowledge-based economy and the changing role of the employee.
Right.
It's almost like he was predicting the rise of Silicon Valley and the gig economy decades before they happened.
Right. He was incredibly prescient, but I think his biggest contribution isn't just in describing what was happening, but in providing a framework for thinking about these issues. He challenges us to look deeper, to consider the human element, the social context, and the long-term consequences of our actions.
And he constantly pushes back against conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
Like the idea that profit is the sole purpose of a corporation. His emphasis on use rather than just profit really resonates with me, especially in today's world where consumers are demanding more from businesses, not just products and services, but a sense of purpose and values alignment.
I completely agree. It's no longer enough for businesses to simply make money. They need to demonstrate how they're contributing to society, whether it's through their environmental practices, their commitment to ethical sourcing, or their efforts to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace. Consumers are increasingly voting with their wallets, and they're supporting businesses that align with their values.
So it's not just about doing good.
Right.
It's also good business. But I have to ask, how realistic is Drucker's vision? Can businesses really balance the demands of profitability with these broader social responsibilities?
It's definitely a challenge, no doubt about it, but I think Drucker would argue that it's not an either-or proposition. He believed that businesses could and should strive to create shared value where their success is intertwined with the well-being of their employees, their communities, and the environment. And there are plenty of examples of companies that are doing just that.
Can you give us some examples? I'm curious to see how these ideas are playing out in the real world.
Sure, take Patagonia, for example. They're known for their commitment to environmental sustainability,
Yeah.
and they've built a loyal customer base that shares those values.
Right.
Or look at companies like Ben & Jerry's and Tom S. Shoes, which have integrated social missions into their core business models. These companies demonstrate that it's possible to be profitable and purpose-driven.
Those are great examples. It seems like Drucker's ideas are more relevant now than ever. But if we're being honest, there are also plenty of companies that seem to prioritize profit above everything else.
Right.
How do we reconcile that with Drucker's vision?
That's a valid point. I think Drucker would acknowledge that there will always be businesses that operate solely on the principle of profit maximization. But his argument is that this approach is ultimately short-sighted and unsustainable. In today's world, where consumers are more informed and empowered than ever, businesses that ignore their social responsibilities do so at their own peril.
Yeah,
Reputations can be built and destroyed overnight in the age of social media.
that's true. And I think there's also a growing recognition among investors that environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG, are material to a company's long-term performance.
Right.
So the pressure is coming from multiple directions. But let's go back to Drucker's analysis of General Motors. He was writing at a time when large hierarchical organizations were the norm.
Yeah.
How do his ideas apply to today's more agile, tech-driven companies?
That's a great question. I think one of the key takeaways from Drucker's work is that organizational structure should serve strategy, not the other way around. He was a big proponent of decentralization, but he also recognized that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The best organizational structure depends on the specific industry, the company's goals, and the environment in which it operates.
So while a hierarchical structure might have worked for a manufacturing giant like GM in the mid-20th century, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for a fast-moving tech startup today.
Exactly. In fact, Drucker might argue that today's flatter, more networked organizations are actually better suited to a knowledge-based economy where innovation and agility are key.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Drucker's concept of the corporation, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those who are leading and managing organizations today?
I think one of the most important takeaways is to recognize that businesses are not just economic entities. They are social institutions with a responsibility to create value for all their stakeholders.
Yeah.
This means considering the impact of their decisions on their employees, their customers, their communities, and the environment.
Yes. And it means finding ways to empower employees, to foster a culture of innovation, and to create a workplace where people feel valued and fulfilled.
Yeah.
And it means recognizing that profit is not the only measure of success. Creating a truly sustainable and successful business requires a more holistic approach, one that balances economic performance with social impact.
Absolutely. And I would add one final thought. Drucker wrote, "Concept of the corporation before the rise of the internet, artificial intelligence, and the many other technological advancements that are transforming the world today." How would he view the impact of these technologies on organizations and on society as a whole? And how can we harness these powerful tools to create a more human-centered, purposeful future of work? That's something worth pondering as we conclude our deep dive for today.
Indeed, it's up to all of us to continue exploring, questioning, and adapting Drucker's ideas to meet the challenges and opportunities of our time. Remember, even the most complex systems are ultimately driven by human needs and aspirations.